Good afternoon. Thank you. I'm Doug Marker, President-elect of the City Club. I'm substituting today for Corleen Kraft, who's on vacation with her children. Welcome to another very interesting City Club program. If I could first of all ask everyone to be sure that you've turned off your cell phones and your pagers, or at least set them to vibrate. We greatly appreciate it. I have a few announcements about coming City Club events and activities with the club. Our next Friday forum, March 18th, is entitled Tightening the Belt. Will spending caps put Oregon on the straight and narrow or in a straitjacket? It will have Don McIntyre, President of the Taxpayer Association of Oregon, and Chuck Sheketoff, Director of the Oregon Center for Public Policy. And it'll be moderated by Larry Wallach, Dean of Portland State University's College of Urban and Public Affairs. We want to extend our gratitude to John Russell of the Russell Development Company for his $5,000 challenge grant towards the build-out and the furnishing of our new City Club headquarters. John's challenge grant was matched by CH2M Hill, Portland General Electric, Schwabe Williamson and Wyatt, and Stoll Reeves LLP. So thank you very much, John. And the matchers and those who matched the contribution. We're very grateful. We are in the middle of our annual membership drive, and I want to take special recognition that I see a lot of new faces here who I assume have not yet had the opportunity to join the City Club. So a couple of incentives today. All members who join in February or March are eligible for a drawing for a special Oregon memorabilia packet that's all packaged in a red radio flyer wagon, and it contains like a vintage original Viewmaster with the original slides of Oregon and a Pink Martini CD and a variety of other Oregon memorabilia. So you'll be eligible for that. Membership forms are on your table, and today, if you join, we will waive the $25 initiation fee. So take a look at the membership form, and please consider joining us on your way out. Details on all of our events and membership can be found on our website at www.pdxcityclub.org. Audio CDs and videotapes of today's program are available for purchase. Our sponsors this quarter are Nike Incorporated, Portland General Electric, and Preston Gates Ellis LLP. Would you please join me in thanking our sponsors? It's with a heavy heart that I have to announce the passing of longtime club member Tom Deering. Tom passed away last week on a ski trip to Idaho. Tom joined the club in 1958. He served most recently on the research board and the board of governors. He's my research advisor on the education finance study, and he'll be missed. We extend our sympathy to his wife Marilyn and his 3 sons and their families. To today's speaker, everybody who lives in Portland knows, and looking at the attendance today, it's, I think, an avocation and a hobby in Portland to care about the historic preservation and the treatment of Portland's historic buildings. And an interesting aspect of this topic, as I was looking through our speakers' scope of work and the issues that they are working with, is that it's not just the buildings such as the one we're standing in today, or sitting in, I'm standing, you're sitting, that benefit from historic preservation tax credits and advocacy. But there's a whole generation of architecture that is about to become historic. And so the issues of historic preservation are truly interesting. And Randy Gregg, the reporter from The Oregonian who covers architectural issues, noted today that, well, first of all, our speaker is coming in advance of a week-long conference of the National Trust for Historic Preservation that'll be held in Portland in September with 2,000 members attending from all over the country. This conference, as Randy Gregg noted, comes at a tipping point in Oregon's history. As Portland is completing projects like the brewery blocks, we've just had ballot measure 37 passed, which has unique and potentially significant new challenges for preserving historic spaces. So this is a very timely topic for us to be talking about. Our speaker is Richard Moe, Dick Moe, who is the 7th president of the National Trust for Historic Preservation. He became the president of the trust in 1993. Prior to his presidency, he served a long career in a variety of public policy positions and as a lawyer in Washington, D.C. But as chief of staff for Vice President Walter Mondale, and in that role he was on the senior staff for President Jimmy Carter. So he brings a long history of public service. He's also been a member of the board of the Ford Foundation, and is a co-author of Changing Places, Rebuilding Community in the Age of Sprawl, a study of the causes of urban decline and the use of historic preservation as a tool for revitalizing cities. So we've got the right speaker and a topic we care about, and with that, I'll introduce Dick Moe. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Doug, very much. I'm delighted to be back in Portland and very privileged to be speaking at the City Club, which is one of the great forums for public issues in the country. And I've long wanted to be able to speak at this great forum, and I appreciate very much the opportunity to do so. I've been here a number of times before, but I must say this is a very new experience for me. I've never been in Portland before when it wasn't raining. And I know this is not typical March weather for you, but I'm happy to have brought it with me, and I promise not to take it with me when I leave. But I love Oregon. I think, I've always thought that Oregon had a lot of similarities to my home state of Minnesota. In fact, I thought that, our cultures are very much the same, politics is pretty much the same. I always thought that it was really the hardy Scandinavians that didn't stop in Minnesota. They kept going to Washington and Oregon. And I also really love Portland. Portland, I think, is, and I don't need to tell you, not only a great city, but it's one of the great cities in America. It may not be one of the largest cities, but it's one of the great cities. And I'm going to talk a little bit about that today. I've had a chance to see more of it on this trip than I have before. I was over yesterday to see Bosco Milligan, which is a fabulous restoration with a fabulous collection. I hope you get a chance to get over there and see it. I've seen a lot of your neighborhoods yesterday and today. I don't recall a city that has so many different kinds of wonderful historic neighborhoods, so well preserved. I haven't had a chance this time to get over to Powell's, but that's, you can order books on Amazon.com these days, but there's no substitute for going to Powell's to actually see a bookstore and get a book. And of course, Rejuvenation Hardware is another great institution here. So you have a lot going for you, and I'm going to get into some of that in my remarks and hopefully even more in the question and answer period. But let me first of all just tell you a little bit about the National Trust. We were founded in 1949. We were actually chartered by the Congress to be the nation's leading preservation organization. We're a privately funded organization. We have about 200,000 members and a staff of about 300 at our headquarters in Washington and our 6 regional offices, and our collection of 25 historic sites all over the country. Our mission is really to help people appreciate the importance of the historic buildings, the neighborhoods, and the landscapes that really tell America's story, and to give them the tools that they need to keep our heritage intact and playing a meaningful role in our lives. We support this mission through a wide range of programs and initiatives. We offer technical and financial assistance to local preservation projects. We present awards to honor exemplary efforts. We issue publications and sponsor conferences and seminars on a wide variety of topics. We expand and strengthen the preservation movement by building the capacity of state and local organizations. And we work at all levels of government to secure the adoption of laws and policies that really support preservation. One of our most important efforts is an annual event that is always the highlight of our year, particularly for our members and our friends, and that's the annual Preservation Conference. 6 months ago, more than 2,000 preservationists from all over the country, both professionals and volunteers, gathered in Louisville, Kentucky for our 2004 conference. And just over 6 months from now, a similar number of preservationists are going to gather here in Portland for the 2005 Preservation Conference from September 27th to October 2nd. This year's conference theme is Sustain America, Vision, Economics, and Preservation. And we're already hard at work developing educational sessions that address this theme, and we're also putting together a menu of tours, workshops, and social events that will give conference attendees a chance to experience your city, and indeed this whole area, and see firsthand how you found innovative ways to meet preservation challenges. We always look to our local partners for insight, advice, and assistance, and we have been enormously lucky in finding just the right people to help us here in Portland. We're working closely with the Portland Business Alliance, the Portland, Oregon Visitors Association, the Historic Preservation League of Oregon, the Bosco Milligan Foundation, and I'm pleased and honored to report that 5 very dynamic local leaders have agreed to serve as conference co-chairs. James Hamrick, who's here today, our Oregon State Historic Preservation Officer, John Russell, who was mentioned earlier, Barbara Sidway and Rick Michelson, the National Trust 2 advisors from Oregon, we have 2 in every state, and John Tess, president of Heritage Consulting Group. And I'm personally delighted that Congressman Earl Blumenauer and George and Eleanor St. Laurent, who are active in a wide range of civic and cultural affairs here in the Northwest, have agreed to serve as honorary chairs of the conference. Several of these people, especially George and Eleanor St. Laurent and Barbara Sidway, arranged yesterday for me to have an extraordinary experience. We flew by private aircraft to John Day in Eastern Oregon, where I'd never been before, and we saw a truly extraordinary historic site called Kamwha-Chung. This is a very historic building right in John Day that in its time served as the social, cultural, and financial center for the Chinese American community that lived there. There were more than 3,000 Chinese Americans in Eastern Oregon that saw this structure that is so well preserved with all the artifacts still in it as really their community center and as the anchor of their community. Through the dedication of a lot of local individuals and others, and I was so honored to be accompanied by Mary Oberst, the First Lady of Oregon, who's leading a campaign to restore and support Kamwha-Chung. So many people have put so much into this, and I took away from it a lot of impressions, but the deepest and most lasting impression is that here in Eastern Oregon, a place with a lot of financial challenges, a place with not that many people, a place with a history of its own, there is not one Chinese American living within 200 miles of John Day. And yet everybody in that community, and for miles around to Baker City and further, people feel very strongly about this place as a part of their own shared heritage. And I find that just one of the most inspiring stories that I've heard. It's not just a state treasure to have this place in your midst, but it's a national treasure. And we are very pleased to be able to deliver some modest resources to help them do their work. Our support for the Kamwha-Chung project is really indicative of the National Trust's ongoing commitment to preservation here in Oregon. You'll see it in the conference next October, and I hope all of you will want to come and take part in these tours and educational sessions and the social events that we'll have. We really want to engage you and get to know you better. We have what we call a diversity scholarship program, which offers financial assistance to enable community leaders and students from diverse ethnic, racial, and cultural backgrounds across the nation to participate in the conference, people who otherwise wouldn't be able to. And a second program, which is being managed by the Historic Preservation League of Oregon, will offer about 100 scholarships to defray the conference expenses for preservationists from Oregon, offering them access to information, techniques, and contacts that will really make them more effective in their work at the grassroots level. So this conference really gives Portland a chance to shine, and I believe people from all over the country are going to learn a whole lot from the valuable lessons of your successes in saving and celebrating the older neighborhoods and buildings that help make this such a special place. I know that these successes didn't just happen. I know that many of them came about through the efforts of some of you, many of you in fact, in this room. As leaders of Portland's business and civic communities, whether or not you choose to call yourself preservationists, and you may not, you are nonetheless squarely in the mainstream of what preservation is all about today. And if that surprises you, it may be that preservation isn't what you think it is. Preservation today is rooted in an appreciation of the value of history, but it's not concerned only with the past. Preservation today is a tool for creating great cities. What makes a great city? Well, it takes a strong economic base, good government, a civic-minded business community, a vibrant cultural life, a population that is diverse in makeup but unified in spirit, and so forth. But the most important factor, I think, is something much more fundamental. What makes a city great is livability. Where do you want to live? What kind of quality of life do you want to enjoy? It's livability. Well, if that's true, then the next question is pretty obvious. What makes a place livable? Well, of course, it has to be safe and attractive. It must provide the services we need, and it should be planned and built in a way that makes it easy to use and to move around in. But there's something else, something very important. A truly livable city is one that makes us feel personally connected to it in a meaningful way. It's hard to feel that sort of connection to a place that has no distinctive character. If you travel as much as I do, you can't help noticing that much of America's built environment is truly becoming fully homogenized, almost as homogenized as a quart of milk. I've heard it described as generica, a place where you can't even tell which city you're in. The subdivisions and strip malls on the edge of Baltimore are almost identical to those on the outskirts of Detroit or Phoenix. Every place looks more and more like any place, and eventually they all wind up looking like no place. It's hard to feel connected to no place, and that's only one reason why preservation is so important. Preservation is a means of saving and celebrating the history and traditions, in other words, the character, that makes every community unique, appealing, and, of course, livable. That's preservation at its simplest and most effective, and it has to do with much more than pretty old buildings. You see, it's becoming increasingly apparent that community livability is the key to community survival. New technologies make it possible for people to work practically any place. And if they can work any place, they're bound to pick the best place, the most livable place. This means that livability is a key factor in determining which communities thrive and which ones wither. Robert Solow, the Nobel Prize-winning economist at MIT, put it this way. He said, livability is not some middle-class luxury, it's an economic imperative. With these factors in mind, I'd like to spend just a few minutes showing you how preservation as a tool for economic development can make a real difference in a city's quality of life. One of the most successful economic development programs in America uses preservation as one of its key elements. The National Trust Award-winning Main Street program aims to breathe new life into commercial districts that had been hard hit by sprawl and disinvestment. The program leads communities through a comprehensive revitalization strategy that emphasizes the rehabilitation of the historic buildings that give Main Street its distinctive character. And today, I'm happy to say, there are 10 communities across Oregon, from Baker City in the east to Astoria in the west, that have local Main Street programs. They join the 1,800 communities that have participated in the program nationwide. Just think of this, in the last 25 years, since 1980, when this program began, these communities have seen almost 100,000 historic building rehab projects completed, more than 60,000 new businesses created, and more than 250,000 new jobs created, and more than $18 billion reinvested in physical improvements downtown. That's a pretty good record for a redevelopment program. Drive through just about any commercial district that has a well-run Main Street program in place, and you'll come to a very simple conclusion. As a tool for economic development, preservation works. The rehabilitation of older buildings works too, in ways that make it one of the most effective revitalization tools available. Data from a study by the U.S. Department of Commerce shows that $1 million spent on rehabbing an older building creates 12 more jobs than the same $1 million spent on new construction. Many of these jobs require skilled craftsmanship, which means that the historic rehab, combined with job training programs, can build a core of workers with bankable skills that will serve them well for a lifetime. Anthropology Ashley Montague has said that the secret to staying young is to die young. But the trick is to do it as late as possible. In communities all over this country, people are showing that old buildings put to new uses can stay young to a ripe old age. Portland has plenty of examples of well-done historic rehab, and I'm very proud to say that the National Trust has played a role in several of them. One is the Hollywood Theater, built in 1926, which we were just talking about a few minutes ago on Northeast Sandy Boulevard. The Hollywood was one of the most ornate neighborhood movie houses in the Pacific Northwest, but eventually went into decline. In 1997, it was purchased by the Oregon Film and Video Foundation, which began an ambitious and ongoing rehabilitation. The National Trust provided a matching grant to help pay for a comprehensive study of the design and condition of the building's facades, and funds are now being raised for a complete restoration, including the reconstruction of some missing elements. The theater is already presenting classic films and live performances, and it faces a bright future as a lively neighborhood landmark and a unique cultural asset for the entire city. Excuse me. The other is the Telegram Building at Southwest 11th and Washington Streets, which I had the privilege of seeing yesterday. Built in 1922 to house the city's evening newspaper, the News Telegram. With its handsome facades and corner clock tower, the building made a great contribution to the city's streetscape. But frequent and extended vacancy had limited its economic contribution until owner Peter Nathan recognized its potential. Now, after a top-to-bottom rehab, supported in large part, I should say, by a $2 million tax credit equity investment provided by the National Trust, the Telegram Building offers 33,000 square feet of top-quality retail and office space. With its distinctive design and historic character intact, it makes a very strong statement that historic resources can be a vital component of sustainable revitalization. The economic impact of projects like these makes it clear that preservation isn't just good for the soul, it's very good for the pocketbook as well. That's why more and more communities are using preservation as an effective tool that allows older buildings to shelter people instead of pigeons, supports heritage tourism, and helps turn urban no man's lands into lively, attractive spaces to live and work. A couple of years ago, USA Today ran an article about what's happened in Chicago. Let me quote just a few sentences from it. It says, downtown has seen a renaissance. River North, an area once filled with factories and vacant buildings, is now a hot entertainment district with art galleries and high-rise condos. The South Loop, once the printing district, has new housing developments, restaurants, and tree-lined streets. Now, you'll notice that the term historic preservation does not occur anywhere in that paragraph, but the rebirth that it describes is really what preservation is all about today. In Denver, where I came from yesterday morning, preservation is the driving force behind the effort that has pulled an area called Lower Downtown, or LODO, back from the brink of utter destruction and transformed it into a vibrant and very highly desirable place to live and work. In Atlanta, in a low-income African-American neighborhood that had known decades of disinvestment and despair, preservation is the spark that is bringing in new investment, new life, and new hope. In cities as diverse as Boston, New Orleans, and Miami Beach, preserved historic districts have made heritage tourism a major component of the local economy. This story is repeated all over the country, from St. Louis to St. Paul, Albany, and Albuquerque, and of course here in Portland too. In areas like the burgeoning Pearl District, which I had this chance to see yesterday and again today, it's a wonderful, wonderful effort that's underway. And it's the same in city after city. The preservation and reuse of historic buildings and neighborhoods is an engine that is driving solid, sustainable economic development. Now, I can't close without saying something about preservation's role in managing sprawl and encouraging smart growth, particularly since I wrote a book about it, Doug. I know this has been an issue of enormous interest here in Oregon, and it's taken on added importance since the adoption of Measure 37. Ever since Oregon pioneered the use of urban growth boundaries in the 1970s, your experience has been watched very closely and admired by many all over the country. As I've traveled around the United States, I've often cited your land use planning laws as an example that other states might want to follow. But last fall, long simmering discontent with this program, I gather, led voters to support Measure 37 by a margin of 61%, a turnaround so remarkable that is still making front page news in the Washington Post as recently as a few days ago. And now, other states like Colorado, Montana, and Washington are considering laws similar to Measure 37. So, what does it all mean? Well, the last thing you need to hear is somebody coming in from Washington to tell you what it all means. That's one of the reasons why I came, is to find out what it means. And I hope during the question and answer period, you might help me understand what happened here and why, and how we can help preserve the values that were incorporated in the Urban Growth Boundary Program, and the values that you have used in land use planning and historic preservation for so long, how we can preserve those values and at the same time address the concerns of those focused on property rights. So I know we'll come back to this. Like every other city, Portland is changing. The question is, what will it become? Will tomorrow's Portland be a balanced, dynamic blend of old and new? Or will it instead be wiped clean of all but a token handful of historic buildings? Will it be thoroughly remade in a shiny new image? Or will it retain plentiful and meaningful reminders of the history that really makes it unique? Right now, there are scores of older buildings all over the city, both downtown and in the residential neighborhoods. These are opportunities waiting to be embraced. If they're torn down or allowed to fall down, they're nothing but valuable assets wasted. But if they're saved and put to new uses, they can help ensure that a fast-growing, ever-changing city will retain some of its distinctive character. They are the keys to the kind of preservation-based economic revitalization effort that will help Portland strengthen its heart without hauling its soul off to the landfill. But preservation-based revitalization will not happen by itself. And planners and architects alone can't make it happen, although we need their help. Saving our heritage is not someone else's job. All segments of the community, elected officials, tourism sites, universities, financial institutions, residents of historic neighborhoods, planners, real estate developers, nonprofit organizations, everyone with a stake in Portland's future has a role to play in capitalizing on its past. We need the best problem solvers in our generation to repair the urban fabric that we've ripped so many holes in over the years. We need the most creative designers to help us figure out how to create places that are lively and safe and supportive, how to transform no place into someplace special. We need visionary thinkers who recognize that by saving and enhancing historic buildings and neighborhoods, we're creating opportunities for meaningful contact with our shared heritage, and thereby strengthening the glue that holds us together as a society. I believe many of those people are here in this room today. Perhaps more than any other group in the city, the interested activist members of the business and civic communities and the professions are positioned to encourage the good public policy, including a strong commitment to historic preservation, that is essential to livability. You are the people that have the power to say, it's not enough to make our city bigger and busier, we also have to make it better. Working together, I believe we can build a Portland that will make us and our children proud. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dick. I'll now open the floor for questions. Questions are a privilege for City Club members. That does mean that you could introduce yourself as a new member and just sign up on the way out. But I also would invite, in response to Dick's invitation, comments, if you'll keep them brief, on your perspectives on what's happened with Measure 37 or other current issues. But please do keep them brief. The first question will be asked by our board host, Gwen Milius. Gwen is a partner with Stuvie Milius Identity Management, a marketing and graphic design company, and Gwen is a co-founder of the City Club's New Leaders program. So I'll turn to you, Gwen.
Thank you very much for your comments. As someone who's monitored historic reuse projects in Portland, I've seen some historic properties languish as owners grapple with rules for renovation of the buildings set by our State Historic Preservation Office. Some of these owners blame these rules themselves for making the redevelopment into a modern use difficult. You know, in a parallel move, which you've mentioned, Measure 37 passed, and some say it's a kind of a baby with the bathwater approach to reforming land use laws. One could say that in that spirit, historic rules might follow. How do people who are interested in historic preservation adjust and adapt their expectations for reuse to make room for economic problems with reusing properties? And what kind of advice do you have for those of us who are interested in those rules and preserving them while allowing economic reuse to go forward?
Thank you, Gwen. That's a very good question, and one we get a fair amount of around the country. Sometimes dealing with preservation rules and regulations can be frustrating, and that's too bad. We do have a long history of asking for careful restoration of historic properties that are on the National Register, that are locally designated. And sometimes there are tax credits involved, and the public benefit that justifies these tax credits is that a building be restored to its original condition, so that the public can continue to enjoy it and appreciate it. Nonetheless, we're of the view that sometimes, particularly when you're dealing with the Secretary of the Interior standards, which is the standard by which developers and others must follow when restoring buildings that are listed on the National Register and receiving some kind of federal assistance, sometimes that can be overly onerous. And we are now working with the National Park System, which administers most of these rules, and our colleagues, the State Historic Preservation Officers. You have one of the best here in James, I must say. And we are trying to find ways to make these rules work better so that we have a good set of rules, but they're not so onerous and not so complicated that they discourage people from going. And I've heard cases of where that's happened. This can also be true with the historic tax credits. Sometimes they can be very difficult to access. We have just helped to draw up a set of amendments to the existing historic tax credit, which we have just had introduced with a very strong bipartisan group of members of the House of Representatives. And this will make it much easier to use the tax credit, particularly for smaller projects, for projects in difficult to develop areas, and where the tax credit is used in conjunction with the low-income housing tax credit. So we are very focused on this issue of trying to make historic preservation more user-friendly, if I may. And some of this is at the local level, too. First of all, not every old building deserves to be saved. And sometimes the preservation movement doesn't help itself when it insists on preserving every old building. But we should make no apology for trying to save buildings that we do think have significance, even if they're used for some purpose other than that for which they were originally designed, i.e. adaptive reuse. You have a fair amount of that going on in Portland today. So it's kind of a common sense rule here when you're dealing with a lot of these issues.
City Club member, you mentioned our urban growth boundary we have in this region. Another part of our regional growth scheme is a focus on town centers and regional centers that have been designated regionally, most of which have a historic setting. And despite a lot of good things that are going on in the region, a lot of those centers are struggling. And I'm curious what thoughts you may have about the role of the public sector or the trust or other organizations to help provide funding for public infrastructure for town squares, plazas, places that give people a sense of place and community in these historic centers. Every time we have a planning committee or study, everybody wants to have a square or a plaza, but there's almost no public money for those kinds of things. And to have true historic preservation, sometimes it's more than just the buildings, of course, it's the place. And I'm curious what thoughts you have on the importance of that role.
Right. Well, that's a good question, too. Obviously, there's no easy answer when you're talking about funding. I mean, I think everybody would agree on the desirability for those kinds of facilities and amenities in town centers, and particularly where preservation's involved. There are different state programs that might be worth looking at. For example, in the state of Vermont, they have a downtown program where, through a variety of funding and other policies adopted by the state legislature, downtowns are favored for state office facilities. They're favored in terms of grants for these kinds of projects that you mentioned. I think sometimes foundations can be approached, but there's no silver bullet on this. So there are some federal programs that can be accessed through HUD or through other agencies. And I think it just really takes dogged determination to ferret out those different funding sources and to aggressively go after them. We don't have what we have at the Trust is what I mentioned in the form of the Main Street program. And let me just expand on this a bit, because it's really designed to make downtowns work. You know, through the 60s and 70s, a lot of downtowns, particularly in small towns, were really emptied out from sprawl and disinvestment, particularly when the big boxes came in. They just sucked the life out of downtown. So what we found through Main Street, and I think my friend and advisor Barbara Sidway would confirm this in her experience in Baker City, Eastern Oregon, is that if you make downtown an attractive place to come and shop and make it serve, and fill in the vacancies and market it properly, in other words, make it work to serve the needs of the people who live in the area, downtown can be made to work again. And consequences will flow from that. And if you would like more information on our Main Street program, I'd be very happy to share that with you, because this is a proven program. As I mentioned, 1,800 different communities all over the country. And my guess is there are other communities here in Oregon which might benefit from this. Yes, sir.
Hi, thank you for speaking. I'm Bob Geary, City Club member. My question would be, which city has the best record for the use of taxpayer dollars in restoration?
Wow. I don't know the answer to that. There are a lot of cities that have done a great deal of work through uses of preservation ordinances, regulations, and so forth, and sometimes coupled with tax benefits. Some states, it's more at the state level than it is at the city level, but sometimes you find city incentives in terms of tax abatement programs. In other words, if you will restore your building, we will not increase your taxes for 10 years. That's a very effective inducement to get a property owner to invest in his or her property. New York has some good programs along that line. Washington, D.C., where I live, does. But the vast majority of cities are experiencing this revitalization I talked about, not through local financial incentives, but because they have found I should say there are a group of developers and other preservation practitioners who have found out how to do this kind of work, accessing what tax credits are available, and putting together these very complex financing packages and making them work and making $1 off of it, and that's a very good thing because we live in a market economy. So these programs really have to work within the market forces that we have in this country. So it's kind of a mixed record. I know that's not a direct answer to your question, but I hope you'll let me get away with it.
Good afternoon, Kirsten Green, City Club member. And our statewide land use planning program used to require the inventory of all historic properties and sites in the state. A few years back, in a revision to that statewide planning goal 5, we went to a voluntary program for cities and counties to inventory their sites. So it's sort of catch as catch can. It's not as thorough as it once was. You know about Measure 37. The governor's office is introducing a bill in the legislature to re-engage Oregonians in the values and the basis behind our statewide land use planning program. So we're anticipating a 4-year discussion on the merits of the program, what should it include, et cetera. Do you have any suggestions for, hoping that bill passes, do you have any suggestions for us so that we don't lose sight of what are really the key values and spaces in our communities, and identifying those as we are tempted to look at the regulatory framework? How do we keep the vision in the heart of our planning exercise? Thanks.
Thank you. Well, I didn't know that you were no longer, the state was no longer required to inventory historic resources. I'm sorry to hear that.
Not all of them.
Not all of them, not all of them. Well, if you're going to save something, you have to know where it is, and you have to know how significant it is. So I'm a very strong proponent of surveying historic resources, and this extends to cultural resources on public lands. Well, let's get into Measure 37. As I said in my remarks, had a lot of respect for the urban growth boundaries and what it did, because it really forced, I think, development inside the circles and contributed to the kind of density that makes historic preservation and livability work in a place like Portland. Now, that may not be universally agreed to, but I think it had that effect, at least for a time. You know, why it was so resoundingly repudiated, if that in fact is correct. You can get I've been here 24 hours and I've gotten about 24 different versions of why Measure 37 was passed. And I think it's probably a combination of all the above. But let me just say this about Measure 37. The urban growth boundaries that existed here, and I met Governor Tom McCall once. I had great admiration for him. He was a unique person, and he had a lot of guts, what he did back there 25 years ago. And Oregon was the only state that really went down this road. And I think it had a terrific effect. Now, it may not have been administered as fairly or whatever happened, I don't know, over the years, but the concept, I think, was very sound and had some good consequences. And it was embraced, I think, by what might be called Oregonian values. And those values could be summed up in trying to preserve a sense of community and what I was talking about in my prepared remarks, livability. What kind of communities do we want? What kind of open space do we want to complement the urban areas that we have? I think property rights deserve a lot of respect in this country. We have always had a lot of respect for property rights in this country. But I think community values also deserve a lot of respect. And they always have in this country. You know, we have always balanced them. And sometimes we balance them differently. But this is why we have zoning. This is why we have land use laws of all different kinds. And it's a question of where you set the balance. But if this Measure 37 is to be taken at face value and wipe out the effect of all that you've had the last 25 years, I think that's off the charts. I think that's out of balance. In my conversations with Oregonians, people don't want that. They want to fix what's wrong with this system, but continue to apply the values. At least I hope that's what you do, but I wait to hear from more of you. Please.
Pat Roomer, City Club member. My question is about a recent decision that the General Services Administration made concerning the reuse of a historic building, the Custom House on the North Park blocks.
Yes.
And my understanding that the legislation that authorized this kind of turnover or transformation of the building, that the National Trust for Historic Preservation was an active part with Congress in that legislation. And the two factors that the proposals were asked to be reviewed and weighed on were historic preservation concept and public benefit. And the finalists in this competition for the Customs House was a community reuse with the University of Oregon School of Architecture and other programs, of Contemporary Crafts Museum and Gallery, and a community center that I happened to direct, so I was part of that process. And the other was a luxury boutique hotel. In late January, the General Services Administration selected the luxury boutique hotel. And what I would like to hear from you, from the Trust's perspective, is when you were part of the legislation, what was the intent of what the weight of public or community benefit was? And second, because the local community backed the community use, readaptive use, what is the role the trust and GSA, and I know you don't work for GSA, pay to in terms of a community priority for the use of a historic building?
Really good question. We did support the legislation that allows GSA to basically give long-term leases on some of its properties that can no longer be used for government purposes, because the problem was that many of these buildings sat unused for literally decades. And as you know, no building that is unused can continue to survive. I mean, they will deteriorate unless they are used and maintained. So we thought it would be better to help them get some of these buildings into the right private hands, not through sale, but through long-term leases, in such a way that would protect the architectural integrity of the building and yet produce a productive use for the community. I went by the Custom House this morning. It's a marvelous building. It should definitely be reused. I can't say for which purpose, because I don't know all the merits. But clearly, community input and community impact should be major factors in these decisions. But I don't know what else was involved. I do know that in Washington, D.C., the Tariff Building, which is an 1840s Robert Mills building, one of the great buildings in Washington, one of the earliest buildings still surviving from Washington, was abandoned, was unused by GSA for decades. It was beginning to deteriorate. And this was the building in which GSA first used this concept. And they did a 75-year lease, I think, to the hotel chain. John, what's the name of the hotel chain? The Kimpton hotel chain based in San Francisco, which has done a lot of boutique hotels around the country, many of them, if not most of them, in historic structures. They have converted that now to the Monaco Hotel in Washington, D.C., and they've done a very good job. And they've done it with the help and oversight of GSA and the preservation community. But that building is now back in productive use. Its historic integrity is preserved. I'm proud to say it's now one of the historic hotels of America, which is our hotel association. And it's so much better than it just sitting there as a rusting hulk. So I hope that's what will happen, not as a hotel necessarily, but I hope that kind of end result will occur for the Custom House here, because that is the goal. Thank you.
Hi, thanks for coming. Leonard Cogan, City Club member. In the restoration of historic property, it seems, the idea of authenticity and original condition seems to be an ever-moving target, right, subject to changing whims of fashion and what's trendy. And it's very obvious when you look at historic property that it was, that was restored 10 years ago, that was done 30 years ago, and it's just, very clear that it was just very much a result of whatever was trendy at the time. Any questions? Any comments about that?
I think there's some truth to that, and I think part of the answer to that is that you have different people applying the same standards differently in different ways. You also have different technologies at work. In other words, what might be a sympathetic window treatment in one decade may not be in another decade. And there's always, just the uneven application of these standards. I mean, we're not dealing with absolutes here in many cases. We're dealing with perceptions, visual perceptions for the most part. And people have to make judgments. So I think that's probably an inescapable part of the process, although it certainly cries out to be minimized. Thanks. Sir.
Howard Glazer, City Club member. Thank you, Mr. Moe, for your message. It's a little late here, unfortunately. I wish you had been here a year or so ago, because Portland recently approved, the Portland Planning Commission and the City Council, the construction of a forest of high-rises along the riverfront that impacts a historic neighborhood. The people in the neighborhood protested, as did many others, to no avail. And I'd like to ask you, how on earth ordinary citizens, ordinary neighborhoods can stop this obsession with high-rise buildings, irrespective of where they are and the impact they have on historic neighborhoods that have been here 100 years.
Well, I know what you're talking about, and these kinds of things can be very intrusive, and they can dramatically affect the quality of an historic neighborhood. So I too wish I'd been here a year ago, but I don't know that I would have made the difference. Let me tell you what I think the general answer is here, is that citizens like you, and I think many of you in this room, need to be advocates. I gather you were an advocate here, but what you really need is the organizational capacity to be heard. And regrettably, neither Oregon nor Portland have really strong, vocal, vibrant preservation organizations. Wish we did. We have some very well-intentioned groups that are doing their best, but we need people like you to come together in Portland to form an organization, perhaps covering the entire state, but coming together to really, and we will be happy to work with you to do this, but there is very little you can do without organization. And organizations mean having very strong, committed volunteers, but also professional staff people. We put a lot of time and effort into building capacity of the organizations like this all over the country, and unfortunately, it hasn't happened here in Oregon for a lot of historical reasons. But we have not given up, and I hope you won't either, sir.
I will be in touch with you.
Thank you. Thank you. Feel free to break in with applause anywhere during the
Richard Ross, City Club member. I'm a resident of an inner city historic district, have been there since 1976, and the district was declared in 1977 as one of Portland's first two residential historic districts. My question goes to the problems of success. And at a coffee last fall with our new mayor, Tom Potter, a big issue came up with the folks at the coffee about the success of our community in historic preservation in Portland and in the inner city neighborhoods, and what the cost is. And one of the costs that people were asking about was, how can young families with children afford these inner city neighborhoods anymore? They used to be a great store of affordable housing. It was when we bought our house for $29,000. In 1976, the assessor told us last year that it's worth $463,000. And people in the room were asking our new mayor, how can we deal with this? And one of the costs of it for Multnomah County is, and I think it's happening all over the country, the inner cities are flip-flopping what we used to have in the 60s of the impoverished inner city and the wealthier suburban ring. We're seeing the flip-flop in Multnomah County. Not necessarily impoverished, but it's the mid-county area is getting poorer.
Well,
so how do we avoid that successful result?
Well, it's the affordability issue, obviously, and you know, you're right. This has turned itself on its head because for many decades we were decrying the fact that the central cities have been emptied out. Now they're being rediscovered. I think the principal reason for that is that in cities all over this country, crime has declined significantly. It's no longer a factor of people wanting to live there. Schools are still a factor for people with school-aged children. And I don't know enough about the schools here in Portland, but in many cases they will prevent families with school-aged children from living downtown. Nonetheless, the empty nesters, the young people, crave these places downtown, but they're not necessarily affordable. One of the things that we've done, unfortunately, is we've gentrified some of these areas, and I think there's some of that that's happened, at least in one area of Portland that I've heard about, where low-income artists have been forced to, by economic circumstances, to move out of one district to another. Affordable housing is a key issue in this country. We are short 2 million housing units for people who need them in this country. Consider this fact: over the next 10 years, there will be 20 million new Americans earning, I should say workers, 20 million new workers. A third of them will be making $20,000 or less. Now, where do you live in America if you make $20,000 or less? This is an issue that nobody in America is paying enough attention to. Not in Washington, not at the state level, not in the private sector. We need to address this question of affordable housing. And we need to, and by affordable, I mean not just for poor people, although that is a much more, you and I think, are going to do okay, sir, one way or another. At least you are. But we need to address this issue in some way. The housing stock is so short, we're so short of housing in this country that we have to find new means of providing affordable housing for young people and for others.
Time for one more question.
Hi, Mike Dennis, City Club member, and I'm going to read this question because it's written by a colleague who's not a City Club member who I think we can arm twist into becoming by the end of this question. How can the National Trust assist local and regional preservation groups to save endangered properties that are owned by the federal government? And a specific example is World War II facilities such as the B reactor at Hanford.
Thank you. We have a public policy operation in Washington that is focused in large part on dealing with federal issues. This is not a direct answer to your question, but we are now about to start a federal lands initiative, which will work with BLM, the Forest Service, the Park Service, to save many of the cultural resources that exist on federal lands that are not adequately protected by present law or present resources. There are, in addition, a number of very important historic resources owned by different federal agencies, some by the Defense Department, some by the Department of Energy, and others that have great historic significance. And we view part of our role and one of the reasons to be in Washington is to be an advocate, a private advocate, to save significantly historic structures in the federal government. And if anybody has any issues along this line, I would hope you would write us, email us, let us know. We will get into it, and we will add to your advocacy capability to try to deal with those issues. Let me just say it's been a great pleasure to be here. We look forward to coming back in the fall in force. Get ready for us. We just love Portland. We love Oregon. You are wonderful hosts. Thank you so much.
Dick, thanks very much. We're adjourned.